Welcome to the Property Voice Podcast, helping you to navigate safely through the world of property investing. Get the lowdown and updates, insights and outcomes on all matters property with a splash of entertainment along the way. The Property Voice, a voice to trust among the crowd. Now, let's get started with your host, Richard Brown.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Property Voice Podcast. My name is Richard Brown, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you join me again on the show today. For those of you who tune into some of my social media channels, I can just tell you that it's approaching 9 o'clock and let's just say the creative juices are flowing. And you know what I'm talking about. Of course, if you don't tune into my social media channels, then you've absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. So I'll just leave it at that. And perhaps you need to check out my social channels to make sense of that. But thanks for joining me on the show today. What I thought I'd do is do a quick follow-up to last week's show, where I talked about the 3 F's of how to profit through property. And the 3 F's were summarized as forcing the discount, forcing the appreciation, and forcing the yield. And I threw in there a bonus one that we get natural capital appreciation over time if we're fortunate, but don't bank on it. So that's a bit of a recap there. So what I thought I'd do this week is just drill down into forcing the appreciation just a little bit more. And I thought I'd start by talking about 10 ways to add value or force the appreciation in property. I might then refer you to one of the metrics that I tend to use when I'm looking at that kind of equation. I call it return on works investment. And then I will return because forcing the appreciation is often considered when we first acquire a property, something new, and we undertake some kind of project. But equally, we can apply some of these principles to our existing portfolio. And I've got another 3 for you. It's the 3 R's this time, so maybe I'll come back to that a little bit later. So a few things to cover off in the show, so let's get cracking. So first of all, 10 ways to add value or force the appreciation in property. Not in no particular order, but number 1, and possibly the easiest one, is what they call prettify the property. Make it look nice, in other words. And we can do this with some internal decoration or even external decor, which might include the garden, and that can increase its curb appeal. And whilst they're not, massive changes, but it can make quite a difference. There's nothing as off-putting as seeing a tatty old garden or, stains on floors and, on walls from damp, that's been repaired even, but it's just still there inside a property. Even just clutter can actually make a difference and can, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, as it were. So you can walk into a property. Hopefully what we're talking about here is getting the valuer if we're refinancing or getting a purchaser if we're selling that property to just be able to easily visualize what it would be like for them to live there. Hopefully there'll be little work to do, so they'll pay that premium. And it's funny actually because just recently I've agreed to sell a property I bought. It was one of the first properties I actually bought a few years ago now, about 10 years ago. And I prettified the property. So I bought this property, I just decorated it, including a few feature walls and things like that. Didn't really do anything else, didn't do any major upgrades or updating. It was a fairly new build house when I bought it. And one of the reasons I was able to get it actually forcing the discount was because it was a new build, but it didn't have any sort of NHBC certificate. And usually that means that, you couldn't sell that property to someone else within the first 10 years unless you've got some sort of new build warranty that you can offer with the property. And that was the case with this one. So I managed to practice with the first F, which is forcing the discount. And as far as the second F is concerned, I did a cosmetic, update, literally painting and decorating the property. I think there was maybe 1 or 2 floors that needed to be just updated, but I spent about £4,500 on prettifying the property. It's a 4-bedroom detached house, so £4,500 is a drop in the ocean really on a property of that kind of nature and size. And I think the figures from memory, I paid about £142,000. And I got it revalued just a few months later for $195,000. So I think there was, to be fair, a combination of some discount going in because of the lack of a new build warranty, and equally the cosmetic refresh or the prettifying of the property combined managed to increase the value quite significantly in that particular case. So did quite well. And in fact, I've agreed to sell that property more recently. And I'll come back to that because the reason I agreed to sell it or decided to sell it in the first place is that the yield relative to the capital growth was out of kilter. And I thought it was a good time to cash in. Equally, the property is outside of my normal area, so I always look at these things and I decide, is it a good opportunity perhaps to, if the value has gone up significantly, maybe to cash out, realise the profit before it gets too out of whack, if as it were, in terms of capital gains tax and things like that. So that's what I did. So that's the first one, prettify the property. The next one, number 2, is I've just catchily titled kitchens and bathrooms sell houses. And really, remodeling or replacing a kitchen can actually have one of the best, returns on investment in the fastest time. Now, it's not the best way to add value to a property, but it's one of the quickest ways to add value to a property. Who wouldn't like a new kitchen or a bathroom? Or if I put it the other way around, what's one of the most off-putting things is seeing an ugly, dated kitchen or bathroom when you go into a property and you're already thinking, oh no, I've got to do something to that. It's going to cost a lot of money, and so on and so forth. So kitchens and bathrooms sell houses. Not only do they increase the sort of appeal, but they actually add a bit of ROI as well. So you can do it in a pretty quick period of time. So, and of course, you don't need to sell it. You can refinance it and keep it. And so updating the kitchen and bathroom is a good way of doing that. The next one, number 3, is what I call increase the usable living floors or floor space. And here what I'm talking about is extending or converting to add value to a property. And this can just think about extensions, think about loft conversions and conservatories. They're the kinds of things I'm talking about here. So you're actually adding usable living space into the property. Some of it, of course, is within the footprint, such as the loft conversion, but an extension or a conservatory is adding to the footprint of the building as well. And what I suggest you do is, if you're looking in your target investment area, is have a look at the houses that have got extensions and conservatories and loft extensions, and do a comparison of those types of properties against the ones that don't. And then you'll understand what the value add potential is. And of course, you can work out the cost, and therefore you can work on, I've already given the game away to my returns on work investment or works investment sums or calculation that I tend to perform as well. So increasing the usable living or floor space is actually one of the best ways to add value to a property, in fact. Number 4 is, I've called it upgrade and refurbish. Now, obviously, some of the elements I'm talking about are part of that process anyway. If you decorate or you put a new kitchen in, then you are upgrading or refurbishing the property. But in this particular example, I'm actually talking about replacing what I call the guts of the property. So this is the plumbing, the gas central heating, and the electrics, that kind of thing. And so if we can bring it up to current standards, we can maybe, improve the energy rating, for example. That's going to be a relevant thing over the time. In the next few years, you probably heard about the consultation about the EPC ratings going to C, I think it is, rather than E as it is now. So it will actually add value to your property in the long run, but in the short term, actually it does too, because especially if you're keeping the property, it'll reduce your maintenance costs, it'll reduce the running costs for the owners. And people like to go into a property knowing that all of this is updated, is in place, and it does have a value. It's perhaps not as obvious a value increase as, say, replacing the kitchen or the bathroom or prettifying the property, obviously, or indeed adding an extension, but it does count, and you can list these things, and it counts especially with valuers, by the way. So valuers, not so turned on with painting a wall, but they are with perhaps replacing the gas central heating, for example. They can see a real value add in that respect. So I think it works particularly well if you're trying to get a value uplift on refurbishment projects. Of course, it can work on flips as well, but perhaps sometimes you don't necessarily need to do all of this on a flip. So I think it works best actually with a refurbishment project. The next one, number 5, is what I call remodel and reconfigure. And this is, unlike increasing the living space by adding an extension, which was a third item, in this case, what I'm doing is using the existing footprint in a cleverer way. And so, for example, you might have seen maybe sometimes you've gone up into a property and you've looked at it's a 3-bedroom property according to the details, and you kind of looked at bedroom 2 and bedroom 3 and thought, well, they're pretty average or even small sized bedrooms. It doesn't kind of make sense. And one of the clues to what I'm about to say is where the windows are often positioned. And often if you've got a large bedroom, some people put a partition wall in and split it into 2 bedrooms, but it might be a small double and a single at best. And all they're really doing is just creating an extra bedroom. But believe you me, sometimes with residential property, it's not the actual floor space that adds value. It's sometimes the number of bedrooms. So a bit like I was talking earlier, looking at properties where they've got, you can look at where there's an extension or a loft conversion, for example, compared to where it doesn't. In this case, if you look at maybe a 3-bedroom versus a 2-bedroom, or 4-bed versus a 3-bed, and just see why by adding an extra bedroom, what difference might it make? So there's other elements of this. You can convert the garage as well. Maybe you can add an ensuite to a bedroom. So maybe you can relocate the bedroom upstairs if it's in an old terrace house bolted onto the rear, which you often see, of course. So just remodeling and reconfigure could actually add value, but do your sums as always. This is an interesting one, number 6. I call it retargeting the marketing of the property. And what I mean here is that you go and look for properties which are incorrectly marketed. They're being sold in the wrong place, in other words. So an example of this is if you go to an auction and you find a property that's done up, well, that's in the wrong place, really. A property that's already done up should really be sold on the open market, and a property that needs work is usually sold on the auction. Of course, both things can apply, but if you start to see a done-up property in an auction, maybe a lot of investors and developers are not really looking for that kind of thing. So it might be an opportunity to arbitrage, buy it at the auction, and maybe sell it onto the open market instead. And there's a couple of other examples, like look for sale by owner listings, because there's perhaps less competition there. If they're not listed on Rightmove, for example, they're not necessarily going to have the same number of eyeballs on them as they will on say, Rightmove or Zoopla or on the market. Look at maybe bulk buying, bulk sales. So buy an existing portfolio or buy a block and then break it up. That's another way of doing it. And another one I thought was really interesting is to kind of deliberately distress a property and then put it through an auction. So as I mentioned earlier, with done-up properties being found in auctions, well, investors and developers are usually looking for a wreck in an auction. So if you take a property that it's not too bad, you can distress it, board up the windows and strip it out, for example, and then put it in an auction. You might be surprised actually at the result you might get that way. So number 6 is retarget the marketing of the property. Number 7 is to look out for and then fix structural issues or problem issues with a property. So here what I'm talking about is things like subsidence, Japanese knotweed, insect infestations and that kind of thing. In fact, I recently looked at a property that's in fact, the property itself doesn't have Japanese knotweed. It neighbours on a church and the grounds, and there's Japanese knotweed that's been identified in the church grounds. And there's a treatment plan that's underway. It takes 5 years to get rid of it properly, and that program is underway in the church grounds. And this property we were looking at is next door, so it's not even directly affected by the Japanese knotweed, but it has actually put people off because Japanese knotweed is pretty aggressive and it'll put off your average homeowner. It's actually not that difficult to deal with. You can put a program in place. And in this particular, example, there isn't actually Japanese knotweed there. The only snag is you might not get a mortgage on it. So you do need to think about how you're going to finance the property in the intervening period. And of course, you've got things like subsidence, which you can correct with things like underpinning and the infestations as well. So fix structural and problem issues is number 7. Number 8 is to change the use or indeed the valuation method. And we're playing kind of arbitrage, but from a valuation point of view here. We're not buying and selling, we're just changing the way in which it's valued. So an obvious example is changing it from, say, retail or commercial property where there's probably already a number of these on the market now, and there's going to be increasingly so over the next few months or so, into residential. So often residential valuation on a cost per square foot basis is higher than, say, retail. Obviously, you need to find the right type of property in the right location to get that kind of arbitrage play, but that's one example. Another example is converting it from what I would call bricks and mortar residential valuation. The valuers always hate me for saying that, but I think you and I both know what I'm talking about when I say the bricks and mortar value, and instead converting it into an investment value instead. So an investment valuation is basing it on its income stream instead of basing it on its bricks and mortar or its resale value on the residential market. And this is particularly useful with say HMOs or holiday lets, for example, which can be revalued in a different way based on its income stream. So that was number 8. Number 9 is legal gains. So here what I'm talking about is to apply some legal changes to add some value. I kind of touched on it last time out, but you could extend the lease. You can get a share of the freehold. You can even split title of a property, let's say, into smaller units such as flats. They're all legal, solutions. And sometimes you don't need to do much more than move paper around to be able to actually increase the value. I remember I bought a property a while ago, and it had a short remaining lease term available. And I don't know if you do know, but the statutory process for extending the lease, you're not allowed to apply to do that under the statutory process until you've owned the property for 2 years. You can negotiate on a voluntary basis with the freeholder to extend it sooner, but of course, the freeholder holds all the cards rather. If you go in after, say, 3 months and say, I'd like to extend the lease on this short lease property, they know that you have to wait 2 years to go through the statutory process, so they can kind of ask for whatever they want, if you like, in terms of extending the lease. So whereas with the statutory process, it needs to be pushed through in a relatively short period of time. It's typically about 6 months if there's not a cooperative freeholder, let's say. So you can move in quicker. Now, one of the solutions is to ask the existing owner to start the lease extension process before you actually take legal ownership, and therefore you can reduce the 2-year statutory wait period. And this is exactly what I did on one of my purchases a little while ago. I asked the current owner if they would start the statutory process for lease extension, and therefore I could step into their shoes, so to speak, once I bought the property. Didn't have to wait 2 years, and we managed to get the freeholder to agree to a reasonable price to extend the lease much sooner than having to wait 2 years, obviously. So it was just pushing paper, a bit of negotiation. You have to sort of be a little bit careful, because if you give the current owner the idea, then they'll probably recognise that maybe the value of the property is higher than they think it is with a short lease. So you have to play a little bit of poker, but that's an example of a legal gain, let's say. And the final one, number 10, is planning, really. But I could add to that permitted development rights. Of course, there's a lot of talk at the moment about planning gain and permitted development rights, and the change of planning rules and regulations, which are being talked about right now. Building a couple of stories above an existing unit, for example, is now permitted development. So there's a number of things we can do here. Obviously, we can build, we can extend, we can go up. We can change the use. There's a number of different angles that we can play. And again, often what we're doing is we're trying to sort of, cut, slice and dice, if you like, a property to get a higher valuation with smaller number of units, change the use, develop, all of that stuff. So, but again, it can be just a paper exercise. Planning uplift is a little sub-industry, really. Finding a property where you can get planning uplift, and you don't even need to actually build it out and do the development. You can literally just sell it on with that increased value. So there we go. There's the list of 10, and I kind of made a little note to myself, and in fact I might come back to this. Well, I will come back to this. I know I will, and that's always to have this phrase in mind, which is, how can I add value? So whenever you're looking at a property, always ask, how can I add value? And there's two parts to this question. How can I add value now? And how could I potentially add value later? Now hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But I did say that I wanted to just run past this idea of return on works investment. And this is really a simple concept. So lots of people look at the uplift in a value. So you take a property, let's say it's 100,000, you're going to do a 20,000 refurb, and then you want to get the end value of, let's say 140, just to pick a number. It's quite handy because it kind of works with one of my rules of thumb, if you like. So you take it from 100, it's going to be worth 140 when it's done. Maybe the work that you're going to have done to it is 20,000. So you've got the total, you've got the cost of the works there, which is 20,000 on 100,000, or 20%, in other words. But you've got the uplift in value, which is 40,000 on 100,000, which is 40%. And of course, you've got that 20,000 pounds profit, which is just under 20%. Profit on cost as well. So there's a couple of metrics there, hard to get over on the podcast, I know. But here's the one I really wanted to focus on with return on works investment. And that's this: just quantify only the work side of it. So in that example, it was £20,000, which was the cost of the improvement works. I've just made up this as an example. So, it's not a real case, but I was looking back actually over my notes, and I think it was 5 years ago that I shared a blog post on the Property Voice website, where I outlined my thinking, if you like, and my strategy in terms of return on works investment. And there's a few examples there, and I'd recounted, if you like, the last 5 projects that I did, and pretty much all of them were well in excess of 200% return on works investment. So in the example I gave you, it was 20,000 was the cost of works, and then the end value was 140,000. So what I'd actually done is I'd uplifted the value from 100 to 140, or £40,000. I'd spent £20,000 doing it, so my return on investment was 200%, i.e. 40,000 on an investment of 20,000. So we always look at the return on works investment. So you look at the profit on total cost, but also the specific question, which is return on works investment. And I always find that's quite handy because it can help you be a little bit more disciplined in terms of the refurbishment or the updating or the extension that you might be planning. And if you can carve it out into separate items, then you can actually try and work out for yourself, well, if I actually do replace the electrics, what kind of value uplift am I likely to get from that? Whereas if I just put a bit of paint on the walls, what kind of value uplift am I likely to get from that? And so on and so forth. You can kind of help you to cherry pick, if you like, the best works that you could undertake on the project to get your best bang from your buck, so to speak. So that's just wanted to run you by that. Maybe I'll put in the link to the return on works investment post from 5 years ago, just so you can have a quick look and a refresh if you haven't been following me for that long, or you might have forgotten anyway. So I'll maybe put that in the show notes for you to refer back to. Okay, so we've covered the 10 ways to add value. We've also covered the return on works investment. So really all I wanted to do now was finish with what I call the 3 R's. Now, right now we've been talking primarily about a new property. So this is a new property that perhaps we've identified. We're doing our desktop appraisal. We're costing out and scoping out our works. We're working out what the value uplift will be, and we're going to decide if that's a project we're going to do or not. Of course, we're going to decide if it's going to be a flip or a BRR style project. Obviously, I'm talking about the lower end here. At the higher end, you've got conversion and development projects, and whether you're going to sell them or whether you're going to retain them. But essentially, you're just going through this thought process. You're working out the costs and scoping out what works need to be done. You're benchmarking against other properties in the local area to see what the value is going to look like. Do a quick test on return on works investment. That's all well and good, and as it should be a discipline that we all do naturally. Almost, I just look at photographs of listings now, and I just mentally tot up what needs doing and what the cost will be, and then I can compare it to comparables nearby to see what the value add might be. So it kind of becomes second nature. But that's new properties. But what I wanted to come back to here was also looking at our existing portfolio. And I don't know about you, but with me, I look at my existing portfolio, my existing individual properties regularly. So at least once a year, which is tax return time. But equally, I look at my properties for other key events. Key events would be things like a remortgage, a change of tenancy, those sorts of things. So you probably look at the individual property on a change of tenancy, for argument's sake, whereas you look at your entire portfolio for the tax return submission. And what I'm doing there is I'm looking at my equity position, and I'm looking at my net profit, rental profit, and I'm calculating return on equity. Now, in property, we get a little bit hung up on return on investment going into the deal. We call it return on investment. Really, a better name for it should be return on capital employed or return on cash investment. But I don't want to get too hung up on that. I think if we use the term return on investment, rather, ROI, we kind of know what we're talking about. But once we've owned the property for a period of time, we should see some capital appreciation. We therefore should see some equity that's growing in our property, regardless of the strategy, whether it's buy to let or BRR. We should see our equity start to grow. And we should also see rental profits start to grow as well. We should get some rent increases over time. Now, house prices and rent increases, they don't track each other in a linear fashion, typically. House prices tend to go up more with wage inflation. Did I say house prices? I meant rental income. Sorry, rentals. Rents tend to track wage affordability. House prices tend to track general affordability, I suppose, and especially money being pumped into the economy. So it's more of an economic indicator, and rents is probably tracking labour rates, if you like, or wage inflation. Don't know if that made sense. Hopefully it does. But what I'm trying to say is they don't track 100% in a correlated fashion. So you get this kind of wave effect. You can get a burst of house price growth, which is potentially followed sometime later by a burst in rental income growth. So you get this sort of lead and lag effect of house prices versus rental growth. So you've got to keep an eye on that, because you could take a decision at one point in time, and maybe just a short time later, it could catch up or reverse because rents catch up with house prices or vice versa. But long story short, looking at existing property, I apply what I call the 3 R's approach. And what I'm really doing is I'm asking questions. And the questions are, can this property be repurposed in some way? Repurposed means, can it be changed? Could I convert it from a single let to service accommodation? Is an example of how it could be repurposed. So that's the first R. The second R is, could I realise greater value add? And if you remember earlier on, I talked about always look for ways to add value to a property, both now and later. So here, for example, what I'm talking about is we might decide that we're going to do, let's say, a basic refurb on a property to get it rented in a very short period of time. But we might have also identified that it could be ripe for an extension or a loft conversion at some point in the future. That's an example of what I'm talking about. So you're looking for the opportunity when you're going into the deal that you could potentially add value later on. And then later on comes, of course, and you think, well, now's the time. Maybe the tenant has left, and now's the time to do that loft conversion. Maybe you've got a bit of extra cash lying around and you can afford to do the job. So you look at realizing greater value add. An example that I did recently that falls into this category is I had a property. In fact, there were 2 types of R that I really deployed here. I repurposed it, so it was a single let, and I repurposed it as service accommodation, short-term letting, and that increased the returns on that property just from doing that. But I also converted the garage. So I added extra living space, usable living space, by converting the garage, and I was able to actually boost the profits on the service accommodation as a result of that. So there was 2 of the 3 R's in operation. Bearing in mind, I already own that property. So this is not one I was going in to buy. This is one that was already in my portfolio. Asking the question, can I apply the 3 R's here? And you're probably wondering, what is the third one? And the third one is really, can the equity be redeployed in a more effective or efficient way somewhere else? And so really what I'm doing here is I look at the return on equity. So that's my net rental profit as a percentage of the equity that's in the deal there. So, and I'm deliberately choosing equity in this case with my own portfolio. So when we go into the deal, we're looking at return on our cash investment. What is the physical pound notes that we put into that property? Whether it's a buy-to-let on day one, it might be a BRR project where we've refinanced and pulled out some of our capital later on, and we've left in a portion of our capital, but not all of our capital. So that's on the beginning of the deal. But as time goes by, hopefully that property will go up in value, and therefore the equity will grow. And so what I'm always looking at is, well, are the net profits, the rental profits, still an effective return on my equity? And not ignoring the fact that I've got that lead and the lag that I talked about earlier between house price growth and rental growth, rental rates growth. I can't speak. I think you know what I'm talking about, hopefully. So you've got that lead and lag effect, but you're looking at what is the return based on the equity. And I personally have a target, I have a KPI, key performance indicator, for my return on equity. And so I'm looking at my entire portfolio, I'm looking at individual assets in my portfolio, and I'm asking myself the question, is that meeting my minimum return expectations from an ROE or return on equity point of view? Now, it doesn't mean if it falls, I use a red, amber, green sort of color code system. If it goes red, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to do something about it immediately, because I'm going to ask some clever questions then. Why is it red? Is it because of there's been a surge in house price growth in that particular location, and there's been a lag in terms of rental rate increase, which is probably just about to catch up. So if I think it's going to catch up, I'll probably leave it, or I'll monitor it for a period of time. If it doesn't catch up, or if I don't think it's going to catch up, perhaps rental rates in the area are stagnant for whatever reason, I might decide to cash in and sell that property. Yes, there'll be transaction costs associated. Yes, there could be taxation. But if I could redeploy the equity that's invested at a much higher rate elsewhere, because I invest in different investment locations, so I'm arbitraging geographically in that sense. And that's exactly what I did, in fact, with the property that I mentioned earlier on in my rambling, and I talked about that property that I spent $4,500. I've got a big uplift in the immediate value. I refinanced it, but then I've had a surge in capital growth over the last 10 years or so. Rents have gone up, but they have not gone up massively. So my ROE, return on equity, started to fall. It's a semi-rural location. I can't really see that rents are going to drive forward and pick up steam anytime soon. So what I've decided to do is sell. Yes, I'll pay a bit of tax. Yes, I'll incur a few transaction costs, but I'll be able to redeploy that equity into a new property and get a better return elsewhere. I'm pretty convinced of that. And that's exactly what I did. So practice the 3 R's with your existing portfolio. So that's, can it be repurposed? Can you realize greater value add than there's already there? And can the equity be redeployed, or indeed should it be? So I tend to advise people who've got a portfolio to apply that kind of strategy, if you like, to looking at their own portfolio. There's a few simple metrics you can do. There's a few qualitative questions you can ask, a little bit of research, a little bit of asking of agents, and you should be able to get a decent picture there. So there we go. I'll just rattle through it. The 10 ways to add value through property, the return on works investment, and the 3 R's of your existing portfolio. Can it be repurposed? Can you realize greater value? And can the equity be redeployed? So as always, the show notes are going to be over at the website, thepropertyvoice.net. And if you want to talk about anything from today's show at all, you can always reach me, podcast@thepropertyvoice.net. I'd be delighted to hear from you. But in the meantime, I guess all that's left to say is thank you very much for listening once again this week. And until next time on the Property Voice podcast, it's ciao ciao.
Thank you for listening today. Now head over to thepropertyvoice.net for more inspirational content and get updates through our mailing list. Join us next time on the Property Voice podcast. And if you enjoyed the show, please don't forget to rate us on iTunes.